My name is Bob Chamberlain, Chair of the First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance of British Columbia. Behind me, or standing with me, are chiefs from all across British Columbia. We have just finished 2 days of meetings in Ottawa, 15 different meetings with ministers, senators, MPs, and various opposition party caucuses. The message that we bring is the support from across British Columbia of First Nations for the Liberal government's transition plan to remove fish farms from BC oceans. We met with Minister Murray, thanking her for the work that she has accomplished on Discovery Islands, that we see this as a vital step towards the protection of the dwindling BC salmon stocks, removing this known impediment to healthy and abundant wild salmon that migrate through the Discovery Islands and further on up Johnston Straits. We've delivered a message to the government that we see this effort that is now underway from the federal government, joining hands with the provincial government's transitioning of fish farms, as a measure of reconciliation for across British Columbia with First Nations. We view this as an initial step of implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. By taking this important step to safeguard the wild salmon for First Nations and British Columbians and the environment, we see that this is a strong action, a clear message to implement food security for some of the most impoverished people across the province. We have come to Ottawa to ensure the government, both the sitting government and the opposition, understand that the First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance represents First Nations from across the province. We have a number, the representatives here today represent in total over 50 First Nations. And the ones that were unable to make the trip would bring this number up to 70. And so what we present to the government is clear, unquestionable, and transparent support for the further implementation by 2025 of removing fish farms from BC oceans. We delivered the message of disregard, disbelief, zero support for the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat risk assessments of fish farms and disease, pathogen, and sea lice to wild salmon. This process is so horribly flawed and industry dominated that it could serve as a case study for a conflict of interest. The chiefs of the Wild Salmon Alliance call upon the Auditor General to revisit the examination of DFO science that was conducted in 2018. We call on the Public Service Commissioner to also join the Auditor General and take a look at what has been happening in the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat. As part of DFO's fish farm transition planning process, one of the stated goals is to rebuild trust and transparency for DFO science. The very fact that this is one of the stated goals clearly demonstrates to the chiefs standing here with me today that there is no trust, that we have experienced very little, if any, transparency whatsoever. Now, the chiefs that have gathered here in Ottawa, we've spoken clearly of the need to protect Aboriginal rights, to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, seek a path of meaningful food security for all of our peoples. But this is not simply a First Nation issue. Should the government continue this path of protecting wild salmon, there will be great benefit for the environment across the province. There will be great benefit for all British Columbians that have a tradition and a history of going fishing with their father or their grandfather. And these are what we wish to see continue for generations to come. We also recognize that there have been historic low returns of salmon to the Fraser River. This past year, we saw 50% of the amount that was projected return. Given the natural occurrence of impediments such as the Big Bar landslide, we know that we are in for a very rough ride in terms of the numbers that will return in the next few years. That the historic low returns that we've experienced will be beaten, that we will see even more lower historic numbers return. And it's because of that reality that we see the intense need to take every effort possible, every measure that's at the tips of government decision-making to safeguard wild salmon from extinction. We have informed the government that we stand prepared to continue the work with them. We've asked that we create a tripartite table, federal, provincial, First Nations, so we can begin to identify existing funding opportunities and give them a target, perhaps, where we can see the transition assistance package that will be necessary for communities and for workers, and be able to see that this transition is a well thought out, well resourced example of the Government of Canada making the right decision for wild salmon and at the same time looking after the citizens of the country. We've also proposed, recognizing that the federal government's DFO ministerial mandate letter says to work with Indigenous peoples of British Columbia and to work with the province of British Columbia. The First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance stands ready to be that group of Indigenous peoples, to begin to formulate a strategy, a plan, and to see the reparation of the environment that has sustained wild salmon since the beginning of time. That we look to existing efforts of the federal and provincial governments and target or fold into those efforts means which assist wild salmon. Of course, I'm talking about wildfire reparation, flood damage, urban encroachment, logging, mining, whatever it is that may be a stressor to the health and abundancy of wild salmon. The First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance stands prepared to work with both federal and provincial governments to do what's best for the salmon, which will be doing what's best for the environment, and along the way accomplish reconciliation goals of the Liberal government to assist in implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And as happy as we were and still are to have met with the ministers and all the MPs that we did, we still have an open request to meet with Prime Minister Trudeau so that we can ensure with absolute clarity the voice of the majority of First Nations is heard at the highest level of leadership in this country, and urge the Cabinet to continue to support Minister Murray on the transitioning of open net cage fish farms, and to do this in a manner that the transition plan begins to build further safeguards for wild salmon. Thank you.
If there's questions.
I have a question. Could you say a little bit more about, you alluded to the threats that you think fish farms pose to wild salmon. You mentioned sea lice. Did you go into some more detail about what you regard as the potential threats of fish farms to the wild population?
I understand the threats from open net cage fish farms to wild salmon being disease and pathogens such as the Piscine orthoreovirus, heart skeletal muscle inflammation, tenacibaculum, and sea lice. And what we have is a very dense area for these disease pathogens and sea lice to be intensified, to be densified, and to be carried with tide, ebb and flow, creating a perfect storm, if you like, that are going to affect the wild juvenile salmons that migrate up from the Fraser River, as an example. And whether it's the sea lice or the disease that affects them, they're hitting the salmon at the most vulnerable time of their life cycle when they're juveniles. And it is at that stage we need every protection possible to ensure that we have an abundant return to fill the spawning channels.
You also mentioned that you were keen on a round table, I think, of Indigenous people. But I noticed that there was another group of Indigenous people from BC here at Ottawa today actually arguing in favour of fish farms. I mean, would you like to comment on that? There doesn't seem to be great unanimity.
Well, I just learned of them being here. I know them all. Some of them are very good friends. However, we see the topic of fish farm interaction with wild salmon quite differently, where they have made a choice to accept certain financial benefits of being involved with that, as many First Nations do with many different industries. But what we represent here is the Wild Salmon Alliance, and the chiefs that are here today. We recognize that the operation of fish farms harm wild salmon. And the harming of wild salmon represents an infringement of Aboriginal rights across the province. And the government, Minister Joyce Murray, is doing the right path by consulting with First Nations from the interior, because what she's doing is embracing the fulsome rule of law from the Supreme Court of Canada, where even the potential to infringe on Aboriginal rights triggers the duty to consult. So she's living up to, and fulfilling the honor of the Crown by engaging with all First Nations that have salmon that migrate through the ocean. And she has stated at a meeting, a roundtable meeting in Kamloops, that the Interior Nations will be a primary part of her decision-making. And so this tells me that this minister has taken it upon herself to examine all available information and arrive at a determination, and a determination that is not chained to spoon feeding from the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat that has industry involvement from the beginning to the end. And this is simply not a First Nation opinion. This has been testified by Dr. Andrew Bateman on behalf of Dr. Brian Riddell and the Pacific Salmon Foundation at the recent FOPO sessions about DFO science. These gentlemen are well respected in the scientific field. These gentlemen participated in 4 of the 9 science risk assessments that DFO stands on today, and they categorically spoke of the incredibly troublesome flaws in the process of CSAS, where industry essentially gets to write their own ticket in defining the impacts that they represent to wild salmon. And for anyone that has a reliance upon salmon in British Columbia, this should be utterly unacceptable from a federal government, that they would include industry in a fundamental way to write their own ticket. And DFO's primary responsibility is to the environment and wild salmon. And that's when we, as the Wild Salmon Alliance, have spoken about wanting to see an independent science body. This is not a new conversation for Canadians. This was part of the 2018 examination of this from the Auditor General. And we have not seen it in action. We've seen the creation of CSAS. This must be replaced. But we should not wait to take further measures of protection for wild salmon based upon waiting for a new science body. We must take the necessary steps now that respect the absolute abysmal state of salmon runs, especially of the Fraser River.
Can I just ask a technical question, which is, as I understand it, you want the salmon farms to become on land, sort of in tanks, is that right? And do you have a deadline, like a date in mind?
I reflect on what the federal government's fish farm transition planning framework document states, that by 2023, the DFO minister will deliver a plan for the transition. The First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance chiefs want that transition to be predicated upon the safety and protection of wild salmon. We, of course, are knowledgeable that land-based closed containment is a growing industry across the country, or across the planet. There is an industry publication called Intrafish, and about a year and a half ago they began a monthly newsletter to update their members on the hottest growing sector in aquaculture globally, and that's land-based closed containment. So we look at industry statements, And we know that there are investors in Canada that want to see this. We know there are First Nations around the province of BC that have expressed an interest in land-based closed containment. That is what we can reach in due time. But the transition of fish farms from the ocean must not be based upon receiving the capacities of that industry into land-based closed containment. We must see fulsome protection of wild salmon, and if that means that these fish farms leave the ocean, that's what needs to happen.
Is 2025 your goal, or do you have any particular date in mind?
The federal government's commitment was to deliver a transition plan by June of 2023, and then they would take it for another year of consultation, and the stated goal within that is a transition plan implemented by 2025. And I know that the Wild Salmon Alliance has given this some great thought, and we have already begun to engage with senior DFO officials about how that transition plan needs to occur. But what we found very troubling was meetings with the Deputy Minister and the ADM, where they were not really open-eared to hear what we were saying. That it appeared to us they were very dug in and entrenched in opposition to solutions that First Nations provided. And so when we see the minister learning, understanding, embracing and acting upon fulsome information, and see senior officials disregard it and try to trivialize process concerns to personal attacks, it tells me there's something very wrong here, because our comments were about CSAS process. It wasn't about this individual or that individual that was part of CSAS. It was about the process.
Can I just ask, there's very many chiefs here, and I'd be interested to know if any of you have any thoughts about the southern orca population and its reliance on salmon. I know there have been many concerns about that population.
That's a very good question, and these are reasons why we need healthy and abundant wild salmon stocks. Whales, bears, eagles, wolves, all manner of the environment and animals rely upon wild salmon. The southern resident killer whale is reliant heavily, as I've been told, on Chinook salmon. Well, the Chinook salmon of the Fraser River are not doing very well at all. And you only have to look at the Salmon Explorer website to see the conservation units are devoid of any kind of data. But when you look at the Discovery Islands and realize that the Fraser River Chinook and the Fraser River Coho stay in and around Discovery Islands well into the fall, amongst all that fish farm pathogen and disease shed in highly stratified waters, it's no surprise to me that there is such an issue with Fraser River Chinook given that scenario. And that will affect the killer whales and all other animals that rely upon it. And it's been spoken here by the chiefs of the First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance. The responsibilities First Nations hold to their peoples, their lands, the animals that are in their territories. This is a responsibility handed down through generations, and it is not lost on this generation of leadership. And to know that salmon, wild salmon, is not simply a menu choice. It's who we are as people. It fills a large portion of our culture, of our traditions and values, and is one that we wish to see passed on to generations to come. And given the crisis state that is BC salmon, this is the time for the strong measures and clear actions to protect the embattled runs of British Columbia.
I'm just going to ask if anyone's online and has a question to use the raise hand function, and you can ask your question. No questions online?
Okay. Well, thank you very much.